It was a quiet Friday evening in late September when the newly appointed head of internal affairs was driving home after an exhausting first week in her position. The sun had already set, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and orange as her silver sedan cruised along the peaceful county road. She had changed out of her formal work attire into something more comfortable, a simple pair of jeans and a casual blue t-shirt that she kept in her office for long days just like this one. The past week had been a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and getting to know her new team. As she drove, her mind wandered to all the changes she hoped to bring to the department. With 15 years of law enforcement experience under her belt, she had seen both the good and bad sides of police work. Her appointment wasn't just a personal achievement. It represented hope for real change in a system that desperately needed it. The road ahead was clear, and she was carefully maintaining the speed limit, already looking forward to a quiet evening at home with a good book and maybe some takeout from her favorite Thai place. The gentle hum of her car's engine and the soft music playing on the radio were helping her unwind from the day's stress. That's when she noticed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She checked her speedometer again, exactly at the limit. Her turn signals were working fine. She'd used them at every turn. Her registration was up to date, and she knew her taillights were working because she'd checked them just last weekend. There was no logical reason for this stop. Following standard procedure, she carefully pulled over to the side of the road, positioning her car well out of traffic's way. She turned down the radio, rolled down her window halfway, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. Years of experience had taught her the importance of these small details. The patrol car behind her sat for an unusually long time before its door opened. In her rearview mirror, she could see the sheriff taking his time, adjusting his hat, and speaking into his radio before finally approaching her vehicle. His hand was resting on his holster, an unnecessary gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The beam from his flashlight swept across her car's interior before settling directly on her face, the harsh light forcing her to squint. Even though she couldn't see his face clearly in the growing darkness, his body language spoke volumes. The way he stood, slightly leaning forward, his shoulders squared, she'd seen this stance before in officers who'd already made up their minds about a situation before it even began. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. After all, she had nothing to worry about. She was following every rule, every protocol. But something in her gut told her this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. She could feel it in the way the sheriff was taking his time, in the unnecessary backup calls she could hear him making on his radio, in the deliberate way he was trying to intimidate her. Little did he know that this traffic stop would become a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire department. The next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of hidden misconduct and finally bring about the change that was long overdue. But for now, she sat quietly, hands on the wheel, watching in her mirror as the sheriff finally began his approach to her car, completely unaware that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The sheriff's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached her window, each step deliberately slow and heavy. His flashlight beam never wavered from her face, even though the street lights provided more than enough illumination to see clearly. She could feel her heart beating steadily in her chest, not from fear, but from a familiar sense of frustration she'd encountered too many times before. Well, the sheriff drawled, his voice carrying a tone that made her skin crawl. Isn't this interesting? What brings someone like you to this neighborhood at this hour? He emphasized the word you in a way that left no doubt about his meaning. The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation wrapped in false authority. She kept her voice steady and professional. Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over? Her hands remained visible on the steering wheel, her movements minimal and precise. The dashboard clock read 8:45 p.m. Hardly what anyone would consider a late hour. The sheriff shifted his weight, deliberately leaning down to peer into her car. His flashlight beam swept across the interior again, lingering on her designer purse in the passenger seat. "This is a mighty nice car you're driving," he said, ignoring her question entirely. "Mind telling me how you came by it?" She felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same one she'd felt countless times throughout her career when facing such thinly veiled prejudice. But years of experience had taught her how to handle these situations. "Officer, the vehicle is registered in my name. I'd be happy to provide my license, registration, and insurance information." "Oh, you bet you will," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "And we're going to take our time checking every single detail." He straightened up, adjusting his belt in what she recognized as a practiced move to draw attention to his weapon. "Because something just doesn't add up here." She reached slowly for her purse, narrating her movements as she'd advised countless others to do in similar situations. "I'm reaching for my documents now," she said clearly, maintaining a calm she didn't entirely feel. The sheriff watched her every move like a hawk, his hands still resting on his holster. As she handed over her license and registration, she noticed a second patrol car pulling up behind the first, its lights also flashing. The sheriff took her documents with exaggerated care, studying them as if they were written in hieroglyphics. "Interesting address," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That's quite an upscale neighborhood for." He let the sentence hang unfinished in the air, but its meaning was crystal clear. She could hear car doors opening and closing behind her as more officers arrived on scene. What should have been a simple traffic stop was turning into a show of force, and she knew exactly why. In her rear-view mirror, she could see 3 more officers approaching, their hands also resting on their weapons. The sheriff was putting on a show now, making a production of radioing in her information. She noticed one of the younger officers shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsure of the situation but unwilling to speak up. What none of them realized was that every word, every action, every subtle gesture was being carefully filed away in her memory. 15 years of law enforcement experience had taught her to notice details that others might miss. The badge numbers partially visible in her mirrors, the specific words being used, the timestamps on the patrol car dash cameras that were undoubtedly recording everything. The confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would shake the entire department to its core. But for now, she sat quietly, maintaining her composure, knowing that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is simply letting someone reveal their true nature to the world. The sheriff was about to learn this lesson the hard way, but he didn't know it yet. He was too busy putting on his show of authority to realize he was actually writing the final chapter of his law enforcement career. The sheriff's radio crackled with static as he waited for a response about her documentation. She could see his growing frustration when the dispatcher repeatedly came back with confirmation that everything was in order. His jaw tightened, and he clicked his tongue against his teeth, a telltale sign of someone whose assumptions were being challenged. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly, his voice harder than before. It wasn't a request. It was a command meant to establish dominance. The other officers moved into position, creating a half circle around her car that was clearly meant to be intimidating. She knew her rights. "May I ask why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle?" Her voice remained steady, professional, the voice of someone who had spent years handling tense situations. The question was valid, and they all knew it. The sheriff's face reddened slightly in the glow of the streetlights. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Now." He tapped her car door with his flashlight, a sharp, aggressive sound in the quiet night. "Something about this situation doesn't feel right, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." She took a deep breath, centering herself. Every movement had to be careful, deliberate. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, making sure her hands remained visible at all times. As she opened the car door, the cool evening air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. Standing up straight outside her car, she maintained her dignity despite the circle of flashlight beams now trained on her. She was dressed casually but professionally, nothing that should have aroused suspicion. Yet here she was, surrounded by 5 officers, all because one man's prejudices had gotten the better of him. "I'll ask again," she said calmly, her words measured and clear. "What is the reason for this stop?" "I was following all traffic laws, my documentation is in order, and I've been completely cooperative." She noticed one of the younger officers shifting uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the situation was spiraling beyond what was appropriate. The sheriff's response was to move closer, using his height to try to intimidate her. "You know, folks around here know their place. They know which roads they should stick to, which neighborhoods they belong in." His words carried ugly implications, but she didn't flinch. "And something tells me you're not where you belong." Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds gathered overhead. The wind picked up, rustling through nearby trees, but no one in the tense standoff moved. She could hear more radio chatter from the patrol cars, dispatchers trying to relay information that the sheriff was choosing to ignore. One of the other officers, an older man with graying temples, tried to intervene. "Sir, maybe we should." But the sheriff cut him off with a sharp gesture. It was clear that this had become personal for him, a chance to prove something, though exactly what remained unclear. She stood her ground, spine straight, chin up. Years of dealing with similar situations had taught her that sometimes the most powerful response was simply refusing to be intimidated. She knew that every second of this interaction was being recorded by the patrol car's dash cams, every word captured by their body microphones. "I belong exactly where I am," she replied, her voice carrying quiet authority. "And I think you know that this stop is unauthorized and inappropriate." The words hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to his authority that made several of the other officers exchange glances. The first drops of rain began to fall, creating dark spots on the pavement around them. The sheriff's next move would prove to be his undoing, though he didn't realize it yet. In his determination to assert his authority, he was about to cross a line that would have consequences far beyond this single traffic stop. As he opened his mouth to respond, lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the scene in harsh white light for a split second. 5 officers, 1 civilian, and a moment of truth that would change everything about how their department handled accountability. The rain was falling steadily now, but the sheriff seemed oblivious to it as he circled her car like a predator. "Pop the trunk," he ordered, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction as if he'd finally found a way to assert his authority. When she complied, he made a show of examining every inch of the spotlessly clean trunk space. Finding nothing suspicious there, he moved to the passenger side of her car. Without warning, he yanked open the door and began pulling things out. Her gym bag, her briefcase, even her lunch container. All were roughly handled and tossed onto the wet ground. The contents of her briefcase scattered across the pavement, important papers getting soaked in the growing puddles. "Careful with those documents," she said, keeping her voice level despite the growing knot of anger in her stomach. "They're official police records." But the sheriff acted as if he hadn't heard her, continuing his aggressive search with unnecessary force. The other officers stood by, rain dripping from their hats and jacket shoulders. One of them, the youngest of the group, took a half step forward as if to help gather the scattered papers, but a sharp look from the sheriff made him freeze in place. The message was clear. This was the sheriff's show, and no one was to interfere. "Well, look what we have here," the sheriff announced, pulling her credentials wallet from her briefcase with exaggerated suspicion. "Quite a fancy badge you've got. Almost looks real." His tone dripped with sarcasm as he turned the badge over in his hands, water droplets running down its polished surface. She watched silently as he radioed dispatch yet again, demanding they verify her credentials for the 3rd time. Her clothes were getting soaked, but she remained standing tall, refusing to show any sign of discomfort or intimidation. She'd faced worse situations in her career, and she knew that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to bear witness to someone else's poor behavior. The rain intensified, but the sheriff wasn't finished. He moved to the back seat, throwing open the door and pulling out everything he could find. A jacket she kept for emergencies, a small umbrella, even a box of tissues. Each item was examined with exaggerated care before being tossed aside, creating a sad pile of her belongings in the growing puddles. One of the older officers finally spoke up, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Sir, I think we've established that." But the sheriff cut him off with a raised hand. "I'll tell you what we've established," he snapped, still rifling through her car. "We've established that some people don't know their place in this town." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder. The sheriff was now checking under her car seats, his movements becoming more frustrated as he continued to find nothing suspicious. His uniform was soaked through, but his determination seemed to grow with each passing minute. She noticed how the other officers were gradually distancing themselves from the scene, their body language showing increasing discomfort with the situation. They could sense that this had gone too far, that lines were being crossed, but none of them quite had the courage to step in. The sheriff stood up straight, water streaming from his hat brim, and walked back to his patrol car with her driver's license and registration. She could hear him practically shouting into his radio, demanding that dispatch run everything again, check every detail, find something, anything, that would justify his actions. What he didn't realize was that with every passing minute, with every unnecessary check, with every item thrown carelessly into the rain, he was only adding to the evidence that would soon end his career. His actions were being recorded not just by cameras, but by the perfect memory of someone who had spent years learning how to document police misconduct. As he stormed back towards her, waving her papers in the air, the sky lit up with another flash of lightning. In that brief, brilliant moment, the scene was frozen like a photograph. Her belongings scattered on the wet ground, 5 uncomfortable officers standing in the rain, and one man about to discover that his authority wasn't as absolute as he thought it was. The rain was falling steadily now, but the sheriff seemed oblivious to it as he circled her car like a predator. "Pop the trunk," he ordered, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction as if he'd finally found a way to assert his authority. When she complied, he made a show of examining every inch of the spotlessly clean trunk space. Finding nothing suspicious there, he moved to the passenger side of her car. Without warning, he yanked open the door and began pulling things out. Her gym bag, her briefcase, even her lunch container, all were roughly handled and tossed onto the wet ground. The contents of her briefcase scattered across the pavement, important papers getting soaked in the growing puddles. "Careful with those documents," she said, keeping her voice level despite the growing knot of anger in her stomach. "They're official police records." But the sheriff acted as if he hadn't heard her, continuing his aggressive search with unnecessary force. The other officers stood by, rain dripping from their hats and jacket shoulders. One of them, the youngest of the group, took a half step forward as if to help gather the scattered papers, but a sharp look from the sheriff made him freeze in place. The message was clear. This was the sheriff's show, and no one was to interfere. "Well, look what we have here," the sheriff announced, pulling her credentials wallet from her briefcase with exaggerated suspicion. "Quite a fancy badge you've got. Almost looks real." His tone dripped with sarcasm as he turned the badge over in his hands, water droplets running down its polished surface. She watched silently as he radioed dispatch yet again, demanding they verify her credentials for the 3rd time. Her clothes were getting soaked, but she remained standing tall, refusing to show any sign of discomfort or intimidation. She'd faced worse situations in her career, and she knew that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to bear witness to someone else's poor behavior. The rain intensified, but the sheriff wasn't finished. He moved to the back seat, throwing open the door and pulling out everything he could find. A jacket she kept for emergencies, a small umbrella, even a box of tissues. Each item was examined with exaggerated care before being tossed aside, creating a sad pile of her belongings in the growing puddles. One of the older officers finally spoke up, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Sir, I think we've established that." But the sheriff cut him off with a raised hand. "I'll tell you what we've established," he snapped, still rifling through her car. "We've established that some people don't know their place in this town." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder. The sheriff was now checking under her car seats, his movements becoming more frustrated as he continued to find nothing suspicious. His uniform was soaked through, but his determination seemed to grow with each passing minute. She noticed how the other officers were gradually distancing themselves from the scene, their body language showing increasing discomfort with the situation. They could sense that this had gone too far, that lines were being crossed, but none of them quite had the courage to step in. The sheriff stood up straight, water streaming from his hat brim, and walked back to his patrol car with her driver's license and registration. She could hear him practically shouting into his radio, demanding that dispatch run everything again, check every detail, find something, anything, that would justify his actions. What he didn't realize was that with every passing minute, with every unnecessary check, with every item thrown carelessly into the rain, he was only adding to the evidence that would soon end his career. His actions were being recorded not just by cameras, but by the perfect memory of someone who had spent years learning how to document police misconduct. As he stormed back towards her, waving her papers in the air, the sky lit up with another flash of lightning. In that brief, brilliant moment, the scene was frozen like a photograph. Her belongings scattered on the wet ground, 5 uncomfortable officers standing in the rain, and one man about to discover that his authority wasn't as absolute as he thought it was. The rain had finally begun to ease as she knelt down to gather her scattered belongings. Water had seeped into her briefcase, turning important documents into soggy masses. Her laptop bag was drenched, and she could only hope the electronics inside had survived the sheriff's display of authority. The younger officers hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help but unsure if they should. Their earlier compliance with the sheriff's actions now weighed heavily on their consciences. Finally, one of them stepped forward, offering her a handful of somewhat dry papers he'd managed to collect. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the documents. Her simple acknowledgement seemed to break some invisible barrier. 2 more officers moved to help, carefully picking up her personal items from the wet pavement. Their actions now were gentle, respectful, a stark contrast to how her belongings had been thrown around earlier. The sheriff stood rooted to his spot, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that made him shift from foot to foot. "Ma'am, if I could explain," he started, but she held up one hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Not now," she said firmly. "Monday morning." She pulled a business card from her wallet, one of the few items that had stayed dry, and held it out to him. Water dripped from her sleeve as she extended her arm. The sheriff took the card as if it might burn him, his fingers trembling slightly. The older officer who had tried to intervene earlier approached her with her gym bag, now soaked through. "I'm sorry about all this," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. His apologies seemed to cover more than just tonight's events. It felt like an acknowledgement of every time he'd stayed silent in the face of misconduct. She nodded in response, understanding the weight behind his words. As she continued gathering her belongings, she could hear the other officers quietly returning to their patrol cars. The sound of car doors closing and engines starting filled the wet night air. One by one, they began to leave, their red and blue lights cutting through the misty darkness as they drove away. Opening her car door, she carefully placed her wet belongings in the backseat. Her phone buzzed, a message from her colleague at headquarters who had received the alert about her credentials being run multiple times. "You okay?" the message read. She typed back a quick, "All good. Talk Monday." The sheriff was still standing there, looking lost in his own parking lot of consequences. His uniform was soaked through, his badge catching the streetlight as his chest rose and fell with nervous breaths. The swagger he'd shown earlier had vanished completely, replaced by the dawning realization of just how many department regulations he violated in the past hour. As she sat in her driver's seat, she took a moment to center herself. The familiar leather smell of her car's interior was comforting after the tension of the past hour. She could see the sheriff in her rearview mirror, still standing in the same spot, the business card clutched in his hand. Starting her engine, she carefully pulled away from the curb. The sheriff's figure grew smaller in her mirror until it disappeared entirely. The night stretched out ahead of her, the wet roads reflecting her headlights like ribbons of silver. She didn't feel triumphant or victorious. Instead, she felt a deep sense of purpose. Tonight had confirmed exactly why she'd taken this job, why her role as head of internal affairs was so crucial. It wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about accountability, about making sure that the power entrusted to law enforcement was never abused. As she drove home, her wet clothes clinging uncomfortably, she began mentally preparing for Monday morning. There would be reports to file, witnesses to interview, and policies to review. But more importantly, there would be an opportunity to create real change, to address not just one incident, but the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to occur. Monday morning arrived with a quiet intensity. The head of internal affairs sat at her desk, surrounded by personnel files and incident reports. Her laptop displayed dash cam footage from Friday night. All 5 patrol cars had captured the event from different angles, creating a complete picture of what had transpired. The sheriff's personnel file lay open on her desk, and what she found inside was troubling. Over the past decade, there had been 23 complaints filed against him. Most had been quietly dismissed or buried under paperwork. The pattern was clear, but until now, nobody had been willing to connect the dots. A knock on her office door broke her concentration. It was one of the younger officers from Friday night. His hands fidgeted with his hat as he stood in the doorway. "Ma'am, I need to report something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just about Friday night, but about other incidents I've witnessed." She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and for the next hour, she listened. The young officer's story opened a floodgate. Throughout the day, more officers came forward. Some spoke about incidents they'd witnessed years ago, their guilt at staying silent finally overwhelming their fear of retaliation. By Tuesday afternoon, her office had collected over 40 separate reports. Officers from different shifts and precincts shared similar stories. Traffic stops that went too far, searches conducted without cause, comments made when supervisors weren't around. Each account added another piece to a puzzle that had been ignored for far too long. The older officer who had tried to intervene on Friday brought in his personal logbook. "I've been keeping records," he explained, placing a worn notebook on her desk. "Dates, times, incidents. I knew somebody needed to do something, but I never had the courage to speak up. I'm sorry about that." She spent hours reviewing security footage from previous months, noting how the sheriff's behavior changed when he thought cameras weren't recording. Department emails revealed a pattern of intimidation, with subtle threats wrapped in professional language. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to look. The investigation expanded beyond just the sheriff. Other supervisors had turned a blind eye, creating a culture where such behavior was tacitly accepted. The dam had broken, and years of suppressed concerns were finally coming to light. By Wednesday, even civilian employees began sharing their observations. A dispatcher recalled radio conversations that had made her uncomfortable. A clerk remembered paperwork that had been suspiciously altered. Each person who came forward seemed to stand a little taller afterward, as if unburdening themselves of a weight they carried for too long. The head of internal affairs worked late into each evening, carefully documenting every statement, cross-referencing every claim. This wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about addressing a systemic problem that had been allowed to fester. Thursday brought a visit from the department's legal team. They reviewed her findings with growing concern. The evidence was overwhelming. not just of individual misconduct, but of a pattern that suggested institutional failure. The implications would reach far beyond one sheriff's career. As she compiled her final report on Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the traffic stop, she thought about how a single incident had cracked open years of silence. The report was thick with evidence, photographs, testimonies, documentation, and data that painted an undeniable picture of abuse of power. But more importantly, it contained recommendations for systemic changes, new training protocols, anonymous reporting systems, regular reviews of traffic stop data, and mandatory supervision requirements. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about prevention, about creating a department that would better serve all members of the community. She looked out her office window at the setting sun, thinking about how one rainy night had set all this in motion. The sound of more footsteps in the hallway caught her attention. Another officer coming forward with another story to share. The investigation wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The hearing room was packed on Monday morning. Officers, administrative staff, and department officials filled every available seat. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch as the head of internal affairs stood at the podium, her evidence laid out before the review board. She began presenting her findings, her voice clear and steady. The projector displayed dash cam footage from that rainy night, followed by a timeline of previous incidents. The sheriff sat at a table nearby, his usually crisp uniform somehow looking worn, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. "This isn't about one traffic stop," she explained, changing to a slide showing years of data. "This is about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long." The graphs and numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. A clear picture of systematic discrimination and abuse of power. As she presented testimony after testimony, the room grew quieter. Officers who had come forward watched as their statements were read, their shoulders straightening with pride at finally speaking up. The sheriff's supporters, who had been numerous at the start of the hearing, began to look increasingly uncomfortable. The sheriff's defense was weak. Claims of misunderstandings, suggestions that his actions had been taken out of context. But the evidence was overwhelming. When he tried to mention his years of service, the head of internal affairs simply played another clip from the dash cam footage, letting his own actions speak louder than his words. During a brief recess, she noticed small groups of officers talking in the hallway. They weren't discussing the weather or weekend plans. They were sharing their own stories, finally feeling safe enough to speak about what they'd witnessed over the years. Change was already happening, right there in the courthouse corridors. When the board returned with their decision, no one in the room seemed surprised. The sheriff's badge and gun were surrendered, his career in law enforcement officially over. But the head of internal affairs wasn't finished. She stepped forward again, this time with a thick folder of proposed reforms. "Removing one person isn't enough," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "We need systemic changes to ensure this never happens again." She outlined her plans: mandatory bias training, a new oversight committee, regular reviews of traffic stop data, and an anonymous reporting system for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The younger officers in the room sat up straighter as she described the new mentoring program she wanted to implement. The older officers nodded approval at the proposed accountability measures. Even some of the sheriff's former supporters were taking notes, recognizing that these changes would make the department stronger. 3 months later, the changes were already showing results. Reports of discriminatory behavior had dropped significantly. Officers were more willing to speak up when they saw something wrong. The anonymous reporting system had revealed other issues that needed addressing, and the department was tackling them openly and honestly. The head of internal affairs stood at her office window, watching officers heading out for their evening patrol. Their interactions with the public had changed, more respectful, more professional, more aware of their responsibilities. The dash cam footage from recent months showed a department transformed. On her desk lay a letter from a community organization, thanking the department for the positive changes they'd seen. Next to it was a stack of applications for the new mentoring program. Young officers eager to learn how to serve their community with integrity and respect. The incident that had started it all, that rainy traffic stop, was now used in training sessions as an example of how bias can cloud judgment and how speaking up against misconduct is not just a right, but a duty. The department had learned that true strength comes not from authority, but from accountability. As she gathered her things to head home, she passed the wall where the department's mission statement hung. Below it, a new edition read, "Integrity is not just our policy, it's our promise." The words weren't just a slogan anymore. They were a commitment being lived out every day by officers who had found the courage to stand up for what was right.